So to start off, I'm Christy Fairholm-Mader, and I'm with Scale Collaborative. And I just want to acknowledge how stressful and uncertain a time it is right now. I mean, we have a incredibly fast-moving, shifting context and landscape, and that for our sector, in particular the nonprofit and charitable sector, there's many implications for what's happening with COVID-19 on, the people that we serve. If we're a service provider for arts and culture organizations, if you're putting on events and providing fundraising events and arts and culture and all those kind of gathering things, training organizations, that we're seeing that people who are providing direct service to vulnerable populations, organizations who do that kind of work, are maybe needing to scale up or respond in different ways. And there's lots of different implications from how we deliver service, how we connect to community, how we communicate to staff, how we communicate to our stakeholders, and so on. So we, on Wednesday, I think last Wednesday, I was sitting in my office and I was had a bit like, oh my goodness, the landscape is changing really quickly, and how do we stay in front of what's going on, or how do we begin to manage ourselves through this time? And the phone rang, and at the other side of the phone was Kimberly Nemrava, and she had just reached out to me and said, Christy, I've spent 30 years in the Canadian Red Cross. I know a lot about managing disasters, and I was sort of looking at what was happening, and I wondered if there was something that we could begin to do to help nonprofit organizations to think about what they can do in the face of this situation. And because Scale Collaborative, our work that we do is around financial resilience for nonprofit organizations, from coaching, consulting, to providing training, to doing, like a lot of sector building. She said, is there a chance that the organizations in your network would be interested in something like that? And I was like, yeah, like we would be interested in something like that. And we know that our sector could potentially be interested in something like that. So she said, well, when do you want me to come by? And I was like, how about tomorrow? So she came on by and she walked us through a process that our team found to be extremely helpful. And at that point, I just stopped and asked her, I was like, would you mind coming and speaking to our sector as a wider organization, or as a wider community around what they can do as well? And she said, absolutely, she'd be willing to do that. We set the time, sent our email and our Eventbrite out to our networks, and now we're seeing that the response to this webinar has been significant, that we have seen response from across the country, across BC. We've nearly hit the Zoom limit of almost 300 organizations signing up to hear about what we can do as a sector and as organizations ourselves to plan and manage this ever-emerging crisis, which is unprecedented in our country. So today we're going to look through the frameworks and tools to help organizations to plan and manage in this crisis. We are going to record it. It's under recording right now, and we will share that out following, as well as some of the tools that Kimberly is going to share today. We will send an email out following that has the PDF of the PowerPoint, has the recording, and has the framework and things to do to follow up. So just a quick about Scale, so that you know that why we are doing this, is that, as I mentioned, Scale does financial resilience work with organization. We really look at how nonprofits and charities can adapt multiple revenue streams and assets to become and maintain their financial resilience in order to serve communities better, in order to respond to the needs of your stakeholders, your sector, your customers, whoever they may be, in whatever words that you use to describe the people that we serve. And at the same time, we operate a co-working space and a shared community space for, again, social change organizations. So because of the work that we do, and as well as our ecosystem building work with organizations, we really have and all of us in Scale have run and operated and been EDs of nonprofit organizations. And so we really have an understanding of how organizations operate, the innovation that they are able to do, and some of the constraints and changes within our sector as it was and still is, in terms of navigating a new world, and then sort of to add on the COVID-19 as an additional uncertainty or a additional way that we need to adapt and change and move, really fits and aligns with the work that we do in the core of what we do. So we're just really pleased and thankful to have Kimberly come in and join and reach out to us. At this point, I want to just pass on and introduce her to you, because she's the reason, or has tons of the information that we're looking to share out. A final thing about the webinar, she'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to take questions, go through the chat, figure out what we can do in terms of answering and trying to theme the questions as well. Afterwards, we'll also provide, as I mentioned, some resources, her contact information, our contact information. So if there's other questions that you have, feel free to connect back to us. So about Kimberly. Kimberly entered the emergency management field as a team, first as a first aider, and the first female ever hired by the Canadian Coast Guard to work in an operational search and rescue role. In 1987, she joined the Red Cross in Victoria to coordinate what was at that time their first new first aid program. Over more than 3 decades, she supported most of the Red Cross programs, particularly disaster management. Large or small, domestic or international, the Red Cross was often involved, including the Asian tsunami, Alberta fires of 2016, Ebola response, and BC fires of 2017. She visited China 1 year after the Sichuan earthquake as part of the Red Cross delegation to learn from their experiences. Kimberly retired from the Red Cross a year ago, where she was the vice president for BC and the Yukon for many years. All right, I'm going to pass over to her, and we'll carry on.
Thank you very much, Christy. First of all, I want to thank Christy and Lee and her team for moving so quickly and being so interested in this information. The situation that we find ourselves is truly unprecedented, and it's really a time for all of us to come together and to work together to get through this experience. There's going to be 3 areas that I'm talking about. The first section is around leadership in disasters. If you're on this call, you've been invited because you're a leader. And the leadership in a disaster response is so vital. So I want to go through some of the principles that we've found, certainly through my experience with Red Cross, with the Coast Guard, and just to be really helpful when you're facing these types of disasters. I want to talk about communication a little bit, because at every single disaster debrief that I've ever been at in my life, and there have been many of them, one of the key issues is communication. It comes up again and again and again. So I thought that it might be helpful for you to get some shared experience that I have in communication, as well as tips and frameworks for your communication. And finally, we're looking at planning in disasters. Now, this isn't long-term planning. This is how do you manage planning in this type of environment where it's changing day to day. We'll be providing you with some templates and some frameworks to help you in your planning process, realizing that our planning literally is changing every day. Our situation is changing every day. One of the most important things to remember about disasters is, for probably yourself, and certainly for the people on your team and those you serve, the first things they'll be concerned about are their families and their friends. And these issues must be addressed before they can even bring themselves psychologically to their workplace and to help deal with the response. So it's a recognition that, first of all, thinking of the family first is completely normal. It's completely understandable. And as leaders, you probably have already seen, and certainly will see, in your team and in your constituents, when they learn a new piece of news or they hear something, and you can sort of see that curtain go down in front of their eyes as they're going, what about my family? What about myself? What about my friends? And that's something that is so important to recognize and acknowledge, and also make sure that when we're working and responding as leaders, that you're able to provide those needs and assurances first, as much as you can, before asking our people to really be able to fully engage in helping the organization. these are 3 articles that I thought were well done. There are many more, and I've added some of them in Appendix A, which is at the back of this presentation. This is our leadership challenge. COVID-19 is our leadership challenge. So why would I frame it this way? One of the things that happens when we're confronted with an overwhelming, and in this case, unprecedented challenge, is that you can move into a state of paralysis. People can move into a state of feeling completely overwhelmed. And this is a time when the leadership in the sector and the leadership in our organizations need to be able to manage that very natural sense when you're faced with this type of situation. It is really common to, in some ways, take disasters personally. You all have full lives. I'd place money on it. Every one of you has very full lives right now. And you would not be alone if you're thinking when this is unfolding, really? Really? On top of everything else? This is now coming down on us, on our sector, on our families, on our communities, and on our constituents. So I propose this leadership challenge as a way to allow us to elevate a little bit above the situation. When written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of danger and opportunity. And while disasters are completely inconvenient, notoriously inconvenient, they are also an opportunity for you as a leader to illustrate your best values and skills and inspire your personnel, your constituents, and your family. This COVID-19 is going to have a major impact on the not-for-profit sector, particularly because the sector serves so many vulnerable clients. And so this frame can sometimes help you just pull out of what can feel like a completely overwhelming situation. So why is this challenge so major? Why is COVID-19 such a huge challenge? And it's really the challenge of exponential growth. And I'm going to give you an example here. There's this brain teaser that goes like this. You have a pond of a certain size, and on that pond, there's a single lily pad. That particular species reproduces once a day, so that on day 2, you have 2 lily pads. On day 3, you have 4, etc., etc. The question is, how long will it take for the pond to be covered halfway? The answer is 47 days. And that's if the pond takes 48 days to be covered completely. Moreover, if you have a pond that takes 48 days to cover completely, that is half covered at day 47, on day 40, you won't even notice that the lily pads are there. And it's because when a danger grows exponentially, basically everything looks good until it's not good. So that's why our governments, our health systems are moving so dramatically to try to get this under control. Leaders must do whatever they can to get ahead and stay ahead of this response. So at this stage, one of the big keys is to go big fast. And a reminder here, in order to go big fast, one of the things that will be vital for your people is to be very concrete and clear about what you're taking off their plates. So as you start to go into planning and response, or as you're in planning and response now for COVID-19, be really concrete about what of all their other workloads you're going to take off and postpone. while it may seem self-evident in your head that of course that's going to be postponed, by saying it overtly to your personnel, it can help give them that sense of breathing room to be able to focus completely, if you have to shift your focus completely at this stage to respond to the pandemic. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to flatten the curve, and you've probably heard this so many times, but I'm just going to quickly review it because it's a really important concept. This is flattening the curve, and on the vertical axis you have the number of cases every day. On the horizontal axis, the time since the first case. One of the key points of this chart, though, is that healthcare system capacity line. Without protective measures, it will be exceeded. With protective measures, it can ideally stay below what that healthcare system can manage. It will be maxed out, but it still allows the system to manage it. This could also be true, the same chart, for our social safety net and all the services that you provide across the country. What we're trying to do and manage the outbreak and flattening the curve is give ourselves time to make sure that we're not completely overwhelmed by our constituents' needs. It's important when you start working in a response like this to take a few minutes to reiterate with your team your organization's goals, principles, and priorities. This may seem like an odd suggestion, but even organizations like Red Cross, who manage disasters literally every day, take the time when they're faced with a new disaster to identify what their goals are, reiterate which of their organization's principles and values will be most important in managing it, and then to identify the priorities. Your organization will be very different. Your goals in your organization and your principles and values and important priorities will be very different depending on what type of organization you are. So if you're in policy, research, or advocacy, they may be very different from direct service, very different from arts, culture, events, and training, and very different for organizations that support other organizations. But it's such an important exercise to do and record, because taking the time now to do it, and it may take as little as 15 to 20 minutes, it helps you get those touchstones that will be so important as you work through this crisis. In an Excel template that we'll be sending out after this presentation, we've created one of the pages to give you something to record this. And I do suggest that you take some time immediately following this meeting, if you're with your team, to go through this exercise. During an emergency and a crisis, it is vitally important to keep in mind that the power dynamic. You as a leader are in a position of power. Even if you aren't the executive director or of an organization, as a manager, as a parent, as a community person, you're in a position of power. And if you do hold those formal positions of power, even more so. Your people, your children, your neighbors, particularly your staff and constituents, will be watching every move you make. I was talking to the former Chief Executive Officer of BC Buildings Corporation at his retirement party. And one of the people around us said, "What will you miss the least after you retire?" And he said, what I will miss the least is how careful I had to be that when I came into work today, remembering that if I had a scowl on my face, if I looked extremely worried, if I looked rushed and overwhelmed, that all the people around me would take that as some sort of bad news. He said, I won't miss that. When I was coaching a young manager at the Red Cross on her first disaster, one of the things I said to her was, don't run. Unless there's a fire, don't run. Because all her team were looking to her and watching every move that she made to see how she was managing this crisis. You, as leaders in the sector, as leaders in your organization, in your community, can make a huge difference by expressing that type of calm demeanor. Communication, as I said, is absolutely vital in a disaster. And it's an area that's always challenging. One of the key tenets for communication that we had in working at the Red Cross is we wanted to make sure that our communication sources were credible, reliable, and verifiable. And there's a difference between those three terms, and each are just as important as the other. If we sent out misinformation, trying to pull it back was a huge task. I remember years ago, there was a tsunami alert, and a news reporter called a small Coast Guard station and said to the person answering the phone, how big do you think the wave will be? And the person made an estimate. Half an hour later, it was on the national news. So it's knowing that information, in times like this, people crave information. And if there's a vacuum of information, this misinformation can fill it. As I mentioned, one of the important things you can do for your people is giving them information repeatedly, particularly accurate information. And within your organization or among your network, try to find good sources of information and assign some people to monitor them so that you can make sure you're getting good information. These are some of the good sources. There are many others, but these are some of the good sources, certainly in our situation now. And you can see Appendix B at the end of the presentation for some links. When we're looking at communication in an emergency, there are some key guidelines to follow. Clear, short, and frequent we find is better than long and infrequent. Remember, misinformation will fill a vacuum. I don't know about you, but I've been receiving so many emails from organizations that I work with that if they aren't getting to the topic in the subject line or the first paragraph, I'm not having a chance to read through everything else. And that's how I will determine if I continue with reading down further into their email or their communication stream. When you're doing communication during a disaster, make sure that you acknowledge fear, grief, and concern, honestly and compassionately. This third bullet could have been in bold. Minimizing, ridiculing, exaggerating, speculating, or promising something that you can't deliver can really be damaging to your team and your constituents. Watch out for communication expectations. When you send something out that people like, they'll probably come back to you and say, that was fabulous. That was so helpful. Can you make sure you do that every day or every week? And it's very easy in our desire to help people to say, yeah, I can do that every week. When we're facing a disaster of this scope and scale that we don't understand how it will proceed, avoid setting up those expectations. Make sure that you can certainly communicate with them as much as possible, but don't try to set yourself up for something you can't deliver. When you're doing communication from your organization, focus on your organization's information. again, in a desire to help other people, it's very easy to try to give them information about COVID-19 or give them information about what's happening in their city or other aspects of it. Focus on the information that affects your constituents and your organization, and then use quotes and links to the experts. They're the ones that are doing the updates, and then you can keep all that work off of your plate. Don't be afraid to say that you don't know something. And if it's really important, do try to remember to follow up. Responding to rumors quickly is important. And then always try to close by assurance. Trudeau has said many times, we're all in this together, or something to that effect, that we're going to get through this together. And closing that is like what would have been a hug, but now is just an elbow bump. Finally, for your organization, try to use consistent spokespeople. For something this unprecedented, your executive director or president is a really good spokesperson at this stage when you're having to make major announcements. Once you're getting down into the details of programming, it's really a good idea to use subject matter experts. And you'll see that done really well by the federal government, is that Trudeau will be doing all the high-level information and then deferring to the health experts to do the subject matter areas so that he can keep clear of them. A couple of things about internal communication. As you can imagine from the Coast Guard story that I told earlier, write and speak with the expectation that information may go external. Make sure that you have more than one set of eyes on information before it goes out, even to your internal audience. Because right now, the tone and clarity is so important. Make sure that your information is going out in multiple ways. People generally need about 4 times to hear the same information 4 times before they digest it, and often in different modalities. So you'll be repeating your information many times. And indeed, if you're not getting sick of repeating the same information, you're probably not repeating it enough. Design your information for your role. So your frontline people will need much different information than your managers or your board. At the same time, avoid making too many different types of communication tools. Try to group those different constituents so you're only having to update a few of your communication tools each time. In not-for-profit sector, we're very collaborative organizations. We talk a lot, we engage a lot, and this is a time during a disaster where you may need to change some of those cultural norms. So if you have a tendency to have very open communication where people will share ideas and share information really easily, this may be a time where you need to clamp that down. Because if misinformation goes out, even with the best of intention, it can cause a problem. To sort of offset the fact that you're managing the information more carefully, you can also consider an anonymous ways to ask questions. You're going to have constituents, certainly, people in your organization that are really concerned about something, but they may be embarrassed to ask. So having an anonymous way to ask questions not only helps lift up those areas, but also helps you create your future communication methods or communication information. Updates and frequently asked questions are 2 really helpful tools that I've certainly found in disasters in the past. And making sure that your most updated information is in a really accessible location for your people. For external communication, some of the same things apply. Acknowledging the situation and the emotions. Acknowledging it when there's been a death. So important. Reinforcing the organizational commitment to values and what standards you are following. So then again, it reinforces that and encourages people to get the standards from credible organizations. People cannot really engage, as I said before, until their needs and fears have been addressed. So depending on the audience, addressing their fears and needs first is right near the top is a really good idea. Being realistic. We come from a caring sector and we really want to help everyone. This is a time to be realistic about what can be done, and when you don't know something, as I said before, letting them know how you'll keep them informed. And finally, sharing encouraging people at the end of the communication and sharing external communication with your board. Don't forget your board. With relevant personnel and your board. And again, I'll just go back to my earlier comment that in the external communication, as we get more of it, you may find that short becomes even more important. Let's go into the planning section. When we look at a situation like this, we're really beyond scenario planning. We're now into phase planning, and many of you will have started this already. For these exercises and for the templates that we've set up for you, we've sort of separated them into 5 areas that, of course, you would expand and adjust as needed for your organization. The first being personnel safety, reduction, and limitation. So how you keep your personnel safe, how do you manage changes in personnel availability, all the personnel needs. The second is work reduction, and many of you will be in this already, deep into this, moving into removing all non-essential, and in some cases, even high priority projects that are no longer viable. Another phase to consider is work reduction or increase. For some organizations, their demand is going to be increasing. How can they start to scale up those and ramp down others? Considering work closure, and then considering startup and ramp up. I think it's important that we include that in our phase planning, even if you don't need to look at, you may not be anywhere near looking at that now. Just putting it up there for your team gives them that sense of hope and reminds them that, yes, we will get through this. Things to consider in your phase planning are: what is your general strategy? What is your goal with respect to this phase? What is your human resource impact? How are your constituents going to be affected? How are your, what are your financial, and I would add here, fundraising impacts and action? What are your equipment and space impacts and action? How is your supply chain going to be impacted? And how are you going to manage the communication? What are key tenets for the communication for those particular phases? This template will be sent to you after the presentation. And we've populated it with some ideas, with some samples. And this is for general planning for your organization. Of course, we know you'll want to change titles, change things around, but this just gives you a starting point. And again, uses those 6 areas to consider when you're looking at how generally will your organization plan. Another page that we'll be sending you in the template has planning by phases. So using the same categories up top, what's your general strategy for personnel reduction and limitations? What's your human resource impact, constituent impact, etc., for that particular phase and then through other phases. Again, these are provided to you for templates so that you can insert your own information and adjust this to be as much use to you as possible. One of the things that I learned many times, certainly in Red Cross and reflected in the Coast Guard, is that consider a coordination team. Consider putting together a COVID-19 coordination team. Now, I have to just say really clearly that this, if you may be a one-person organization, and I want to really acknowledge that. And so this may seem a little bit of a weird recommendation, but it's how do you, in this situation, several people may fill the same role, but the idea is what skills do you need to have around the table to manage this disaster? It may be your volunteers, it may be your board, it may be you, or it may be a bigger team. The coordination team should be led by the director or a senior person. Sometimes the director simply needs to have time to do other engagement pieces, but it needs to be led by a senior person, and it needs to have a direct reporting line to your most senior person so that you can get timely action. The function areas, and you may want to add to these, but some of the key ones are who's going to lead it, and then as this response goes on over weeks and months, who else are you going to have lead it? Who else are you going to have to support this? Representation from your operations and of course program delivery, finance and ad hoc and fundraising, communication, human resources, and then your regional or facility leads. What are your different geographic leads? This is what a standing agenda looks like, or an idea of a standing agenda. One of the most important things, and you may be hitting this already, is that it's really easy to get caught in a lot of meetings when you're in an emergency response. There's all this new information coming at you every minute, and the first thing people want to do is meet with you, whether that's your teams that deliver programs, whether it's your funders, whether it's your donors, people, government, they'll want to meet with you in order to share information and get things done and make decisions. So it becomes vitally important that our meetings are highly structured and organized to be as efficient and effective as possible. This is an example of what a standing agenda could look like for your coordination team. And the meeting for a coordination team is usually 15 minutes to an hour. If it goes over an hour, that may be the first meeting, but once you've done all that initial planning, it's getting those updates. The items are, what is the status? And again, I go back to have someone responsible for saying, what's the status today, so that you can avoid people going into a speculation mode. Often there's comments from the director or certainly the lead to say, where are we at right now? How are people doing? Or you know, just the opening and the welcome, and to reiterate the priorities for the day, acknowledge what may have happened the day before, and reiterate you know, what they're going to be doing now. Quick updates from each area with their next steps or issues. Summary, of course, by the chair, and then confirming date and time of next meeting. Now, here are some of the tips that we've found over the years. As I say, run tightly. You're going to have to do a lot of training with people to be brief and high level. Training with people on how to take things offline. Limit the attendees. As it becomes apparent that these meetings have good information and decisions are made, you may find that more people want to attend. If you're running the meeting, make sure you're very deliberate about who you have join. Because once you've created this particular culture of being very, very crisp and on focus in these coordination meetings, you're going to have to train every new person. shadowing replacement so that you can get that overlap for at least one day, where if somebody's replacing somebody, they come in for one day with 2 people and then the next one takes over, but only the person, the lead, speaks for that area. And then emphasizing in the strongest possible terms that this information is confidential. This is where you as a leader want to get the advice from your high-level people on what to do, what are the options confidentially, and then taking action. But people need to understand that under no circumstance do they share this information beyond that very tight team until you and your team coordinate it. You can't see this. I had a dialog box just come up on my computer, so I'm not sure if you're seeing that as well, but I've only got a couple more slides, so I'll just read them. Make like a duck, calm on top and paddling like crazy underneath. The next steps. It's easy at this time for people to say, we should have done this a long time ago. We should have done this planning. We should have had this in place already. And this is a time to just let that roll off you. Remember, yes, it's true the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is still today. So what do you need to do today? Certainly filling out, if you haven't already done so, your organizational and leadership priorities, and starting to work, if you've not already done it, on some of that high level planning so that you can start moving as an organization would be what, certainly top priorities. This is going to be a long response. It's going to have a long recovery. And some of the realities of disasters is there are phases where you're rushing around like crazy, everyone's rushing around like crazy, and then suddenly you have to hurry up and wait. You have to wait. Suddenly, you really can't do anything until something else happens. And this will also happen when you're trying to mobilize, for example, teams to take care of your constituents. You'll be recruiting a whole bunch of people to take care of your constituents or to do a special project related to the pandemic. And you'll start the recruitment and they will get busy and ready to go. And then there will be a phase where they have to wait for other parts of the organization to catch up. So it's a good thing to warn your people that this is normal. The other thing to be aware of is that it is a marathon, not a sprint. We need to pace ourselves, take care of ourselves, and take care of each other. Finally, we will get through this together. And so why am I so sure of that? Think of the times that teams have come together and done something miraculous. And the one I'm going to use, the examples I'm going to use are the times where you probably remember that soccer team in the Philippines who got lost in that cave, and they were in there for weeks. And an international team of cave rescue experts came together and did unprecedented work to get them out. You probably remember, I think it was coal miners who were stuck in their mine. And again, they were all rescued because teams came together and made amazing and miraculous things happen. As difficult as this time is, and it will get even more difficult, I am absolutely convinced that we will see amazing and miraculous things happen as we mobilize our leadership, our creativity, and our determination. Because one of the key things is that we all have a common cause here. We all have a common, if you will, enemy situation that we're trying to get a hold of. And when I think, if you're feeling down at any time, just think right now, the brains and the intelligence that is being focused worldwide on this particular issue. That also applies to your community and your constituents. So don't hesitate to reach out to ask all those people, all those experts that you can access within your network for support as you go through this.
Kimberly, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Christy speaking again. Yeah, I want to reiterate that we've seen a real response from community organizations trying to figure out not only how we support our communities as they go through the crisis, how we support our employees, how we plan for the financial implications that this is going to have on our organizations, and how we speak together as a sector to begin to address those challenges, as well as to be able to put forward some measures that can assist us as a sector to navigate the challenges ahead. So the tips and the framework that you provided was really helpful in terms of being able to think through how we go from priorities, how we communicate that out, and how we begin to look at that now planning, that next month, and then if it's a longer term crisis, that longer term planning for our organizations. In terms of scale, the things that we were just thinking about that we would like to offer as part of our support for the sector is to, if there's an interest, and you can just send a little note in the chat box or respond to us later in the email that I send out to you with all the resources attached to it. Interest for us to have a Slack channel where we can communicate with each other as leaders as we begin to navigate this evolving situation. And so if people are interested in that and staying in communication with each other and building a network of allies to help us lead in this place, then please let us know, and we're happy to pull that together. We also, I think, have an opportunity as a sector to speak about what we need in terms of being able to be resilient through this crisis, and I think that's being able to then advocate quickly with a united voice to say, you know, these are the things that we hear coming from small businesses and coming out for other sectors, but for the nonprofit sector, don't forget us, and that we have certain things that would very much help us to navigate and remain strong in as we navigate this crisis as well. And so our offer for that, as Scale's offer, is to work with other organizations that work sector building, or work with organizations or are helping do advocacy work to convene a conversation about what would be the key things that we would want to make sure are delivered on all different levels of government. You know, we have municipal governments as well as provincial governments and federal governments, and we see a federal response, but there's other levels of government and funders that can also respond and assist. And so being able to provide some of that thought and suggestions at this point, I think would be really helpful. And then the other thing that we can do that would be helpful would be to, if you're an organization and you're encountering a challenge, especially if you're trying to navigate how to plan financially, how to plan through this, I mean, we're happy to hop on a call and brainstorm a little bit to look at where referrals can be, and to connect to some, you know, some peer-to-peer learning and support if that makes sense. So, you know, we have to be careful and mindful of our own capacity and resources as we go through this, but we're really looking at ways that we can support organizations to respond, to grow, to thrive, to be resilient in this time. So please feel free, and we put my name up there as well. So we have Kimberly and her contact information. If you're looking at specific questions around how to plan and strategize through this crisis, we have my name if you want to connect around sector responses and how we can advocate with one voice. And then Lee Heron, who is a principal with Scale as well, he's willing to take emails and calls from organizations that might just need to bounce something off of him. And I'm sure that there are many other people in communities that provide this kind of support. And so being able to really reach out and to have that connection and network together as we get through it together. So there are some questions that we have for you, Kimberly, and I'm going to go through the chat box and answer them. Do a little question and answer. And then when we come to that, there is an opportunity for people to If there's any, yeah, so we'll just go with what we've got coming in. So the first question that we have that came first in was just, when is too much information too much? If are people receiving information overload, and are we, and how do you know if it's too much information? So that's the first question.
I think all of us, it's such a good question. I think all of us are getting information overload. The skill in this day and age is how to filter the information, how to help your personnel and your constituents filter the information, and then how to get the information that's vital for your people and your constituents, how to raise that in their profile. So it's again, I would say trying to those key messages and having some key messages that are very specific to your organization and your constituents, that are fairly short and are really relevant. If they can get that message once and they see that it's really relevant to their situation, they will start looking for that information. So it's really the quality of the information you're getting out and how relevant it is for your stakeholders that will elevate your organization's information in their eyes and make it a priority.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question is just about, in terms of coordination meetings, how do you balance sort of using tools like Slack for those kind of coordination materials versus like in person, those 15 minute to hour long meetings? How do you know which one to use?
There are so many tools out there and really good tools. What I'd say is our experience is as especially when you're in, my experience is when you're in the real throes of an emergency and there's a huge amount of things going on. One of the most important things about the coordination meeting is that you have people's attention. So when these are done in person, many organizations, like if it's in person, literally people have to put down their cell phones. Because as a leader, the last thing you want to do is have these vital coordination meetings, people being distracted from them. So whether it's in person and you're putting down your cell phone, or that you set it up so that people are on video conference. I do find that when people are on video conference, they where they need to have, you require, if they're, if you can do so, or set the norm that is that they have their video conference on so that you can see that everybody is paying attention, and just really reiterate how important it is that people stay focused, because it's just, there are some situations, like when a situation is evolving, someone may have to step out. But what I also used to do, which was helpful to set the norm, was at the beginning of those vital meetings, I said to everybody, I need anyone to tell me if they can't give me their 100% attention right now. And some of them were dealing with situations that, even though our meeting was important, they needed to be able to step out if something else came up. And we would name those people, would say, okay, so-and-so and so-and-so may have to step out because of this situation. But we just really created the norm that these meetings were vital. And if you were stepping out for this period, it was exceptional, and you checked with the chair first.
Thanks. So there's a couple of questions about, what are the potential scenarios here? How long might this last, etc. And one of the questions is how to find out information. I just want to remind everybody that we have a slide at the front that talks about where to get that credible information from, that is often unknown, and that's why this situation is evolving so quickly. And we also have appendix slides that will come out to you as when you get the PDF of the PowerPoint that has those links and those ways that you can access those information sources. So I recommend that, and staying up to date and following those. One of the questions that came on that builds on that is, what do we do when there's a difference between the recommendations that the government's providing and the reputational or I'm going to say that the social pressures that are coming around it? For example, we have a question here about that it's okay to put on meetings or have events under 50, but that there's such a strong message around social distancing that it could be reputationally challenging if you went forward with a meeting. So what could organizations do when they're encountering a difference between the policy recommendations or the official recommendations and sort of where the social social feeling is at.
Yeah, you know, this is a part of the challenge, of course, as leaders. Like, it's a huge challenge as leaders. This is, in some ways, what you know, I'm sure you do every day, but on a smaller scale, much smaller scale. Is that is one, again, it helps in getting credible and verifiable information. But I think this is a leadership decision, and it's a management decision. And certainly, I would encourage you to err on the side of safety. Remember that if your people do not feel that you care about theirs and their families and friends' health and safety is a top priority, then they will have a very difficult time, or may even simply refuse to report to work. So this is, you know, a really tough situation, and it's about making putting any measures you can in place, and it'll change day to day to put safety as an absolute priority. It links back to your values, and I can't imagine any organization that doesn't have safety as one of their values.
So there's a question here around, can this group speak on behalf of the nonprofit sector? And I'll speak to that, and sort of that we're seeing the response coming in around businesses and closures and so on. And this is where Scale certainly sees a need for us to speak up as a sector around what we're experiencing, what we're seeing, and what our concerns would be, so that government responses that are coming out take into consideration our sector. I would recommend that everybody hop onto Imagine Canada's site. They have a letter that just went to Trudeau that highlighted some of the challenges that they are anticipating in terms of the current responses being proposed and how they might miss the needs of nonprofit sectors. But the federal government's not the only organization or level of government that can respond. So we're right now currently talking to our local government around what they can do around supporting the nonprofit sector. Things like, if they have a city-owned property that nonprofits are occupying, to what's the potential to reduce the rents on those to give us some of the financial break? What's the potential to, you know, look at having their granting program get dispersed pretty quickly and move it into unrestricted funds, so that organizations can deploy and use those funds as they need, not necessarily for the program's activities they originally applied for. So encouraging funders to think that way, to allow those resources to then shift to where we need, so that we can keep our staff employed, keep our businesses and our enterprises and our organizations going over the long term, looking at ways that we can extend EI to our contract employees, which sometimes are, you know, nonprofits use a lot of contract employees. So really looking at how we can advocate for those folks in our communities as well. So I think there's a number of different ways that at Scale we've been thinking about and looking to do with our local government, as well as conversations with our funders, and then our provincial government as well as federal. So I think there are a number of organizations at each provincial and each region that are speaking and maybe taking advocacy, but that's definitely a place that we're gonna, our organization will also reach into our networks and with the folks that we connect with, to begin to also put forward just some of the measures that we think will be practical to help navigate some of the long-term financial implications of this. If there's other things that people hear about, you know, it sounds like there's some interest for some peer-to-peer connection and a Slack channel. So we'll post that up, and then people can share that out, and we can have those conversations and continue to the more people that speak out, the more organizations that present proactive responses to this. Thinking down the road, I think is how we're able to help, you know, not just our organizations, but our communities be resilient and thrive. Somebody did ask about sharing out the contact list. So I'm not sure if we're able to share out the contact list. Usually that's a privacy issue. But I think what I'll do is I can invite everybody who wants to be involved in a further conversation to the Slack channel, and then that builds that community. And, you know, it's very open to other organizations that were not able to attend. We'll post the recording. People can send it out. You can invite people to the Slack. I mean, it's really around us as leaders in our communities being able to navigate this together. And I think there will be times when we need to support each other and just be like, oh my goodness, like this is happening. But also times we can really exhibit leadership. Lots of times we can exhibit leadership in our community and to our constituents. So someone did ask if we could all turn on our videos so we can see each other. If you have a video that you can turn on and are able to do that, sometimes a face is a nice sense of just who's in our community and who's here. So welcome to do that and to scroll through. Does anybody have, I'm just trying to think, someone would like to do an organization specifically on organizational health and survival. And yeah, Lee Heron and I are happy to have a conversation about that and see if there's something else that we can put out specifically around different tools that you can use around that kind of organizational planning and survival in that realm. Good question around what a Slack channel is. A Slack channel is basically Slack is an online conversation tool. You get invited in and you agree, you get invited in, you say yes, and it's a little like forum, and you type in and up pops things. You can see it tracks conversations. So instead of us emailing back and forth, it puts it in one place where you can follow the discussion thread. It's really easy. And then like once a day, you get an email saying, hey, this is what people talked about. And so I'm not a technological person, but I was like, wow, that's easy. I can do that. So, and did that. So you can see that invite taking. And again, if you're not interested, then you don't have to accept. But if you are, it's a way for us to support each other through this leadership challenge and opportunity. So I'm looking. Steve Gray said something about BC BC Civil Liberties Association around the Emergencies Act. Again, I recommend everybody to just follow. We don't have any comments on the public policies that the government is coming out with, but just to follow and track and to talk to your MLAs, to talk to your MPs, so that they're hearing any concerns that you have that are coming up. Yeah. Any other final comments or questions? I'm going to pass. I'm just going to scroll, see if we can. Kimberly, can you push through to the final 2 slides so people can see the resources?
This is this is the family links. Here's some sample sources of information. And just so that you know, the Public Health Agency of Canada sites, they have a whole bunch of links on their site. So this will link you to other links. And these are some sample considerations for your personnel and your constituents.
Okay. Well, I know you're all doing amazing work. We're in this all together. Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's been really an amazing phone call that you phoned me last week and just gave a pathway to begin to navigate through this. And let's stay connected, stay in touch, and take care, everyone.